This is called Black Inventions. I hope you enjoy it as much as I enjoy doing it. Nowadays, when you mention science or an invention, many people just feel that it came from the white man. Oh no, they feel that is whites only created technology and all them machine that we just use daily. But what the damn fools don't know, blacks created things also. But in books today, black people works they don't show. Oh yes, children, biology, science and their chemistry is only white scientists they see. But tell them who built the first block, it was Banneker, a black man. G.D. Sampson started the clothes dryer, a black man. Today when you watch that electric light, a black named Latimer had the foresight to use carbon to make bulbs burn bright. A black man invented that light. A black man invented that. George Washington carver revolutionized agriculture to produce more food for America. Oh yes, and in 1862, a common slave, I'm telling you, invented the propeller for the ship's crew. Henry Jones with his black locks to transport food in trains and trucks. He brought in the system of air conditioning. Oh yes, 1836, brother, a common slave, Henry Blair, gave the world what we call the corn harvester. And tell them the first successful heart operation, a black man. Daniel Williams, the egg beater by W. Johnson, an ex-black man. Elijah McCoy for lawn sprinklers, and today in all the machines and cars, he made cylinder lubricators. A black man invented. He pump in your car. A black man invented that. When Granville Woods made his draft, the white folks began to laugh until he invented the railway telegraph. Oh yes, J.A. Pearl, a black farmer, 1899, as a thinker, gave the world the celebrated lawnmower. Yes, Percy Julian hit the scene when he took a little soybean and made a cure for arthritis the world had never seen. Oh yes, so my friends, please understand that many inventions, they were made by the hands of many a black man. You want more? Riding saddles made out of leather. 1878, the fire escape ladder. Black man. This from Africa, that science began. And if I only mention them Egyptian, you'll see that all them things claimed by modern man is a black man invented. Now if you join the chorus, we could do this some more inventions. Sing with the chorus. A black man invented that. Mathematics. A black man invented that. Cosmetics. A black man invented that. Architecture. A black man invented that. The steel band. A black man invented that. Writing shorthand. A black man invented that. Medicine. A black man invented that. Alcohol. A black man invented The subway,
a black man invented that.
the traffic light,
A black man invented that.
medicine,
A black man invented that.
the reggae,
A black man invented that.
jazz and bongo,
A black man invented that.
calypso, began to laugh until he invented the railway telegraph. Oh yes, J.A. Pearl, a black farmer, 1899, as a thinker, gave the world the celebrated lawnmower. Yes, Percy Julian hit the scene when he took a little soybean and made a cure for arthritis the world had never seen. Oh yes, so my friends, please understand that many inventions, they were made by the hands of many a black man. You want more? Riding saddles made out of leather. 1878, the fire escape ladder.
Black man.
This from Africa that science began. And if I only mention them Egyptian, you'll see that all them things claimed by modern man is a black
Black man invented that.
Now if you join the chorus, we will do this some more invention. Sing with the chorus.
A black man invented that.
Mathematics,
A black man invented that.
cosmetics,
A black man invented that.
architecture,
A black man invented that.
the steel band,
A black man invented that.
writing shorthand,
A black man invented that.
medicine,
A black man invented that.
alcohol.
A black man invented.
Who built the first block? It was Banneker, a black man. G.T. Sampson started the clothes dryer, a black man. Today when you watch that electric light, a black named Latimer had the foresight to use carbon to make bulbs burn bright. A black man invented that light.
A black man invented that.
George Washington Carver revolutionized agriculture to produce more food for America. Oh yes, and in 1862, a common slave, I'm telling you, invented the propeller for the ship's crew. Henry Jones with his black locks to transport food in trains and trucks. He brought in the system of air conditioning. Oh yes, 1836, brother, a common slave, Henry Blair, gave the world what we call the corn harvester. And tell them the first successful heart operation, a black man. Daniel Williams, the egg beater by W. Johnson, an ex-black man. Elijah McCoy for lawn sprinklers, and today in all the machines and cars, he made cylinder lubricators.
A black man invented
He pump in your car.
A black man invented that.
When Granville Woods made his draft, the white folks began to laugh until he invented the railway telegraph. Oh yes, J.A. Pearl, a black farmer, 1899, as a thinker, gave the world the celebrated lawnmower. Yes, Percy Julian hit the scene when he took a little soybean and made a cure for arthritis the world had never seen. Oh yes, so my friends, please understand that many inventions, they were made by the hands of many a black man. You want more? Riding saddles made out of leather. 1878, the fire escape ladder.
A black man.
This from Africa, that science began. And if I only mention them Egyptian, you'll see that all them things claimed by modern man is a black man invented.
A black man invented that. A black man invented that. A black man invented that. Oh, yes. We're not boasting, we're just educating the world that a lot of the things we take for granted were invented by black people. Black people. And the only reason we have to tell the world that these things were invented by black people is because the world had come to the conclusion a long time that black people were not people and so could not invent anything. And so we have to, deep into the 21st century, still be talking about the first black this and the first black that, when a lot of the first things were invented by black people. And you know, they call us racist in Guyana for that. A lot of them watching it tonight. Listen to racists. David Hines, look at me playing. A black man invent this and black man invent that. The curse of being black, but we beaten back that curse. We beaten back that curse. Good evening to you. I know I've missed a couple of days, and it's just one of those periods, the end of the semester, and it was too much. So we took a couple of days off last week, I think Thursday and Friday, without due notice. And I want to apologize sincerely, but we are on, and all is well with me. Poor Kidaki had to be getting calls about whether anything happened to me. No, I am alive and well, and we're still in the struggle. Tonight we're going to be talking about ancestral lands, African ancestral lands, and a law was that is being debated and will be debated on Wednesday in Parliament, what they call the acquisition of lands for public purposes. They are attempting to amend that law, and what some of the black activists are arguing is that that amendment will threaten and black ancestral lands, African ancestral lands in Guyana. Yesterday, IPADG held a panel discussion on the subject. Deon Abrams, attorney at law Darren Wade, and IPADG's chairman Vincent Alexander were on. I did not get to see all of it, but I saw, for the most part, a lot of it. And we have Vincent here tonight and Darren Wade. They are going to weigh in on that very important subject, because the subject of land remains a very important subject in Guyana. Land and race, land and ethnicity is very, very, very important. And it's one of those issues that never goes away, never goes away, never goes away. I see my friend Evan is asking, what course? Well, the course that people who are not African, and even some Africans, put on African people who talk about anything African. We are racist. They've changed the definition of racism in Guyana. The definition of racism is someone who believes that his or her race is superior, and then take that prejudice, link it to law, and turn it into policy. That's a racist. Terence Campbell, just the other day, pointed out to the vice president that he has a tendency. He has a tendency to bend the truth. And the vice president promptly did what? Accuse Terence of racism. Soon as black people open their mouth and criticize the PPP or criticize any Indian leader, you're racist. For the most part, the Indian elite in Guyana, and perhaps Portuguese and them, and some black people too, have changed the definition of race in Guyana. The definition of race for them is if you say anything about African, you are racist. But we're here to tell them that the definition of a racist is one who believes his or her race is superior. That's where it starts. That's prejudice. It's not racism yet. It's prejudice. But then you use the power at your disposal to turn that prejudice into racism. So a government whose leaders believe that black people planted food, cash crops, instead of planting rice to export, that it meant that they were inferior in their decision making. But then those people turned that narrative into an official government document. They used their power to take a prejudice and turn it into policy and send it to the United Nations. That's racism. But anyhow, tonight we are going to be talking about an attempt to deal with land acquisition policy and how that policy is affecting negatively African people's ancestral land. You all hear the story. Share the link, share the link, share the live. There's not much of that. And we are ready to go with our discussion tonight. So whether you're joining us from in Guyana, outside of Guyana, welcome to Politics 101 on a Monday night. And tonight we're talking black people business. To our Indian brothers and sisters, hold strain, because sometimes black people business is your business too. Because you see, when black people bolt the chains of slavery and shove down that gate and come off that plantation, it means that when Indians and Chinese and Portuguese came, they came as free people, not as slaves. So sometimes the business of one race has an impact on other races. So although we're going to be talking about black people business tonight, it's Guyanese business, because all of us live in Guyana and all of us are affected by what happens in Guyana. Let's go. Attorney at Law Darren Wade, good evening, my brother. Good evening, Brother Vincent.
Good evening, good evening.
Brother Darren, are you with us?
I said good evening, but I did not unmute. Good evening to you, Brother Hines, Mr. Alexander, and the entire of Guyana, everyone who's on here listening to us this evening. Very interesting times.
Thank you very much. Darren, let me start with you. Because we have this bill that is going to be debated on Wednesday. So far as we understand, it's an amendment to the Acquisition of Lands law. And the thesis is that this amendment threatens the security of African Guyanese ancestral lands. Tell us what this law is about, and give us a broad sense of what it is attempting to do.
Thank you, Brother Hines. Let us put into context the law. Everyone has a right to property by the Constitution. However, there are certain exceptions to the Constitution in relation to the protection of those rights. the government can compulsory acquire lands for developmental purposes and so in the national good. We have the compulsory acquisition land. The current bill that is up for debate in Parliament is to amend that legislation to give the minister a wider discretion. For example, section 3 of that bill state, section 3, 21A, that's section 3, amending 21A of the bill, where any land is acquired under this act, an interested and authorized person may make a request to the minister for an advance payment on an account of any purchase money or adequate compensation payable under this act. And if the minister is satisfied with proof of title, the minister shall promptly make an advance payment in respect of the land in accordance with the subsection. In Guyana, we have what they call absolute and indefeasible title. A person transport or registration of title says who owns the title, is determinative proof of who owns the title. However, this piece of legislation gives the minister, and it says proof of title. It did not say transport is proof of title. It did not say a registration of title is proof of title, or even lease or estate grant is proof of title. That is the problem here. It gives a wide discretion to the minister. We are aware in relation to the law, as I mentioned earlier, in relation to prescriptive title. You have title to that land without even having the transport, because your title is crystallized after the exclusive occupation of the land and having it in your possession for 12 years or more. So based upon the law of prescriptive title, the title holder, or the paper holder rather, the paper holder may not have good title, but the real title may be in the port with prescription who has been there for adverse possession. So what this does is give the minister a discretion whereby someone could appear to the minister with a letter, and it says here what it says. It must be made in writing, and it's not even sworn. I was giving credit because I believe if you give a sworn document, an affidavit, you could be lying. So it says it may be made in writing. So it doesn't call for an affidavit contain particulars of the claimant's interest of the land and such other particulars the minister may reasonably require to enable him to estimate the amount of purchase money and adequate compensation in respect to the advance payment to be made. This is troubling because of the discretion that it gives to the minister. Not only for people of African Guyanese who for decades, Mr. Alexander, argued today that since coming out of the plantation system, we had this issue. Over 100 years ago to today's date, we have been struggling with these same policies. So this is a further assault on the rights of all Guyanese, in particular people of African descent who have bought land and have taken possession of these lands.
Darren, you started off your presentation by talking about context. Let me ask a question here. I mean, there must be something that triggers an amendment to a law. We already have a law.
This is in direct response. This is the indirect response to what is happening in Peter's Hall, whereby the people of Peter's Hall challenged the government in court because they were not satisfied with the valuation.
Mm-hmm.
So now they sued the government and they came with a private valuators. So as I said, the wide discretion. So instead of having someone who's unbiased, so the minister could get anyone and say your property is valued $100 million. And every Guyanese should be concerned with this piece of legislation, whether or not it's African Guyanese or East Indian Guyanese or Portuguese Chinese or Guyanese or Chinese Guyanese. mixed Guyanese, they all should be concerned with this legislation because of the discretion, the authority, and the power that is granted to the minister. I believe that such of legislation will be challenged in the court. Should it be assented by the president? However, I'm afraid of the sprint because probably knowing the PPP, this documentation, this letter of which this amendment speak of or refer to are already in the making. And as I mentioned earlier, there's the issue of good faith, whereby the minister could argue that when he acted in good faith because he believed he had the authority to so act. So that is the issue.
Yeah,
that's
Vincent, let me bring you
in. So should the minister, the president pass the bill, the minister go in action immediately and disenfranchise many Guyanese.
Mm-hmm. Vincent, let me bring you in here. Darren makes the point that this thing affects all Guyanese in the private capacity. How do you then make the linkage between a particular kind of effect this bill is going to have on African Guyanese and ancestral land? Make that link for us.
I think the question that arises here in the first instance is an understanding of what's ancestral lands. Darren will tell you that in our laws, there's no provision protecting, quote unquote, ancestral lands. And so we need to start off by understanding when we say ancestral lands, what do we mean? And when I talk about ancestral lands, I mean the following. Our ancestors bought villages. For me, all of the land which was purchased by our ancestors may be defined as ancestral lands. Notwithstanding the fact that those lands were purchased and therefore, for all intents and purposes, were initially privately owned, but they were purchased to a large extent by a collective, and they are ancestral insofar as they are lands purchased by our ancestors, to which we, the descendants, have a right by inheritance. So all of those villages and all of those lands in those villages may be described as ancestral lands, having been purchased by our ancestors, and a right that exists for us to be the beneficiaries of those lands as an inheritance. Secondly, those villages also had lands granted to them by the crown. And so those lands which were granted became the property of the villages, really the property of the people, collectively owned. And in that regard, those lands should also be considered to be ancestral lands. So all of the lands that we acquired, or ancestors acquired, whether they purchased them or whether they were bequeathed by the crown, they became our property. And the extent to which it is our ancestors who acquired them, and we have inherited or have a right of inheritance, those are ancestral lands. But you see, notwithstanding the fact that our law does not describe ancestral lands, there is a description of ancestral lands in the context of the law of land universally. And so in that regard, we may extend our understanding of ancestral lands beyond the lands which we acquired by purchase or by grant to lands which we have perpetually occupied over time. Those may also be described as ancestral lands. Those are lands that we have occupied, and there is evidence of the occupation for an extended period. Those may also be described as ancestral land. So we're talking about three categories of land. Those purchased by our ancestors, those granted to our ancestors, and those occupied by our ancestors that occupation would have been for an extended period of time. There's also the argument, which mirrors some of the arguments of the Amerindians, that lands where African artifacts, African Guyanese artifacts can be found. Lands which have been developed by our blood, our sweat, our labor, may also be considered to be ancestral lands, because those lands acquire their value from our input, our act of bringing civility and making those lands habitable. So that's a fourth category that may be referred to. But I think for the immediate discussion, the categories that are critical would be those lands purchased and those lands granted. So that, how does this relate to the bill? The bill talks about acquisition. And therefore, any land, whether ancestral land or otherwise, could be an object of this bill. Any land could be an object of this bill. So that means that our lands, our ancestral lands, can also be an object of this bill. And therefore, we have to contextualize the action of the government in terms of what they're doing. Because whilst any land can be an object of this bill, there's a history to the manner in which African ancestral lands have been treated. And therefore, this bill enhances, poses a greater threat along the continuum of the way in which our lands have been treated. And in that regard, we need to make the observation that when our foreparents acquired lands, they acquired them as private lands. But along the continuum of the development of local government, some of those acquired lands, those that continue to be communal and undivided, came under the control of local authorities. Mm-hmm. So although they were initially private lands, mm-hmm. they acquire a status form. Government, local government, acquired control over those lands. And the extent to which the local government is not representative of, mm-hmm. or does not constitute a group of African people, is the extent to which others can now make determinations about those lands. So for me, this bill really is a moment of awakening, not only in relation to the threat posed by what this bill intends, but a moment of awakening in terms of how our lands have been treated from the very inception on to present day, and provides an opportunity for us to be awakened and to take action in relation to our lands, including action in relation to the present threat.
Vincent, before I bring Darren back in to talk a little bit about West Berbice, because that has been one of the major theaters of this struggle of African people to hold on to ancestral land. You mentioned something, and I think for the purposes of our audience really understanding, I would want you to repeat it. And that is that our lands were bought individually, But when we created the villages, because we had to buy the land, and then we create villages, people ceded some of their individual lands to the collective, so for a playground, for collective purposes. And those lands over time, because they weren't owned by individuals, as local government developed, became the property of the local government. No sweat, insofar as the local government was the government of the people who bought the lands and ceded those lands for public purposes. But once local government then moved out of the domain, exclusive domain of the people of that collective, that village, then the problem arises where communal land, which were once private land, are now pilfered away from those people into state land. Do I get it right?
Let me address it this way.
Yes.
You're onto it. We bought villages in two forms: communally and proprietary.
Mm-hmm.
Communally meant that we bought the entire village as a collective.
Right.
So if I'm not mistaken, in Victoria, I think it's 38 persons who came together
Yes.
and bought the village. They got a transport. That was one transport for the entire village. One transport for the entire village.
Mm-hmm.
What they then did was to do some sort of survey to give to the 38 persons in the first instance what may be called homesteads.
Mm-hmm.
They did not. So those people with homesteads would have gotten their own individual transport subsequently. But the rest of the land continued to be collective under the original transport.
There you go.
But what they did was they had a policy, a practice, and even in terms of the individual transports, the individuals who purchased and now had homesteads had an entitlement to land for agricultural and other purposes.
Yes.
And the entitlement really specified acreage and things like that. In addition to that, some of the land which did not come under the homestead arrangement were dedicated for communal purposes.
Yes.
Meaning, could have been pasturage,
Mm-hmm.
could have been recreation,
Mm-hmm.
and could have been for social services,
Burial grounds.
churches, burial grounds, and schools. But the point to make is that those lands were all private insofar as they purchased them. And as a collective, they owned them and they were treated as private property, the owners being the collective. And so that very purchase is what gave us entitlement. And that entitlement was actualized in various ways in terms of surveys and some people getting specific lots, other lots being kept for communal use, other lots being allocated for agriculture in relation to the people who had specific titles. Now, in addition to that, the government, the Crown at the time, also granted the village additional land. So the village acquired more lands that were not purchased, but that were granted. But those also became the collective property of the village. The collective property of the village. And it was for the village administration to allocate out and determine how those lands were to be used. So they could have allocated them to individuals for agricultural purposes. They could have used them for communal purposes. They had the authority to determine how that would be used. Now, this all started really with management committees that were not local government in the statist sense. In other words, they're not government.
Mm-hmm.
It's a voluntary coming together of the people to administer their local affairs. That's how it started. However, over time, these voluntary bodies became government bodies insofar as they became enshrined in law with authority, the kind of authority governments have. to exact from people taxes, to impose penalties on people, that emerged. And so what happened now is that you had a government body, for all intents and purposes, now responsible for those lands, and in particular, those lands which had not been divided, but were still being used collectively, including the grant lands. So far, so good. What has happened is that our local government system has evolved away from village councils, and the villages were homogeneous. Buxton is Buxton, people of African descent. Victoria is Victoria, people of African descent. Ansgrove is Ansgrove, people of African descent. So even though they established village councils that were quote unquote government, it was the people's government, the people governing themselves with the powers of government. But we've gotten to a point where we no longer have village councils. And those village councils, those villages are now part of a wider local government areas called neighborhood democratic councils. And the powers that resided in the villages have been transferred to the neighborhood democratic councils. So the neighborhood democratic councils now have authority over those lands. But those councils are not peculiar to the village. They are a wider body of people. And in many instances, if not most instances, the wider body of people is not an African homogeneous group. It's a group of Guyanese. And what you can have found is that in the local government elections sometimes, that neighborhood in which these villages are embedded is seeded by elections to a group made up of Africans plus others who may be in the majority. So, for example, we had a situation in Fowles Buxton, not at these last elections, at the prior elections.
The one before, yes.
Where the PPP won the elections. And therefore, their councillors, by the majority, had control over Buxton if Buxton has such undivided lands.
Yes.
And the same pertains in BV Triumph, and the same pertains in the Plaisance industry area, where the villages, the original villages, are but part of a bigger body.
Bigger body,
the
yes.
bigger body gets authority to make decisions about the villages, when in fact the bigger body doesn't have the historical entitlement because it's made up of people who do not have a right of inheritance to those lands. But they now have a legal right to make decisions about those lands. And herein inherently lies the injustice in our system, in our legal system, in our governance system, that allows Africans, descendants, to lose control of what they are entitled to by inheritance to a government body that does not have that entitlement because of its composition.
Because of its composition, where the law is not grounded in the history, the peculiar history, because our village movement in Guyana is a very peculiar history. It has not been replicated in any other part of the African diaspora. And so when you're making law that has to do with land, you have to take into consideration that peculiarity. If you don't, you end up with the argument that you all are making here, that you're making a law about how you acquire land without taking into consideration or maliciously ignoring the history of land acquisition as far as African Guyanese are concerned. I think we get the drift there. Darren,
Before you go to Darren, let me make two other points.
Yes.
When we went to London for independence conference, specific attention was paid to the Amerindians and their lands.
Yes.
specific attention was not paid to the Africans and their lands, although there was a category of lands that for all intents and purposes were and are African lands. So that we kind of misstepped, whether intentionally or otherwise, in not dealing with the question of African lands at the point of independence. We dealt with Amerindian lands. As a consequence of that, there was an Amerindian Land Commission, and all that has followed onto today really flowed from what happened at the Independence Conference that paid special attention to the Amerindians and their lands. And we can call them their village lands as well, because they also had these villages. So that's the first point I want to make. So that we've had an aberration from the very inception. Secondly, the United Nations, in the Declaration of the Decade, after years of struggle by the people of African descent, in the diaspora in particular, came to the conclusion that there was need to address these aberrations, these things that affected people of African descent. And what they said in general terms was that even though we've gotten independence, even though we got emancipation, that some of the institutions and the laws that were stacked against us have remained in place and should be reformed so that we can get the recognition and justice that is duly ours in pursuit of our development. So the theme for the decade: recognition, justice, and development. Recognize what belongs to us. Justice, give us what belongs to us. And consequentially, we can use it for development. And they specified that what is needed is institutional changes and legal changes. The manner in which our lands are controlled by local authorities is what we may consider to be the institutional and legal arrangements that are now operating to our disadvantage. And the UN, in its declaration, has called for those matters to be addressed. There's a recognition that there are lots of things that have occurred that have done so to the detriment of the recognition and the justice of people of African descent. And the time has come when this should be addressed. And therefore, that's why I start off by saying, what is happening today is a moment when we need to turn to look at what has happened almost in perpetuity and to use this moment to correct it. Because it's a moment when, once again, the laws are being tampered with to embed and deepen the institutional and legal norms that inhibit us from exercising our rights and having a just regime in pursuit of our development.
Vincent Alexander, chairman of IPPAD-G, here tonight in this very, 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 very deep conversation about lands and acquisition of lands and the relationship between ancestral lands and governance. Darren, let me bring you in. You can add anything to what Vincent has said, but I want you also to give us a sense of how West Bobis has been a kind of test case, if you will, about this clash between ancestral lands on the one hand and the state attempting to redistribute lands to others who are not Africans, and that African ancestral lands become part of this mix. Talk to us.
Thank you, Brother Hines. I hear Mr. Alexander's point. I hear it, and at first glance, I like the point, but I don't believe the issue in relation to having Africans, or because the villages doesn't control the lands anymore, is as a result of the land being disposed. Because when we look, for example, at BV, whereby, and that is a test case, those lands is an APNU council, those lands are ancestral lands. The persons who disposed of those lands illegally are African Guyanese, African Guyanese control council. So this whole issues of ancestral lands needs legislation to protect these lands, because there's greed and dishonesty is not peculiar to one set of people. It is part of mankind. And the reason is that we do not have any legislation, any that protects our land. When you go to the Amerindian Act, you will see a whole process there to dispose of Amerindian land. I shared a video today on Facebook where Afro-Guyanese, I believe it's a shelter or one of those Amerindian communities, they confer him with residency today, and he was so excited to be a resident in the Amerindian village. They had to say that he could, after 3 years of being of good behavior, good report, and so forth, and they are satisfied as per character and repetition, he was given permission to be determined a resident of that village. So this communal land, this African ancestral land, it needs legislation. Putting it in villages that are Afro-Guyanese, if they are dishonest and they're greedy and there's greed, they are going to do the same.
But I don't think you're disagreeing with Vincent, because Vincent does speak about the institutionalization and the expansion of local government by law. So what you are saying is that there needs legislation to restore the land back to our people.
No, I'm not saying that. I am not saying that. I'm not saying that. I am saying that the ancestral land need protection against everyone.
Right.
They need to have against everyone.
Yes.
Because regardless of the group, and as I use the BV example, what transpired in BV, that is what we need.
But wouldn't the government be saying...
Let me jump in here, David. I made the point, and I think you sought to comment on that what the UN said, that there needs institutional and legal framework change. Now, notwithstanding my contention that the lands were moved from under the control of Africans when they controlled their villages, notwithstanding that contention, which made the situation less contentious,
okay,
the institutional arrangement and the legal framework does not necessarily simply return the land to the African Village Council. I haven't commented on what arrangements should be made in a new institutional and legal framework. And in that regard, I'm at one with Darren, that yes, because the institutional and legal framework we're talking about were colonial institutions and colonial frameworks.
Right.
Colonial. And we have to deal with this question of decolonizing. And in the colonial arrangement, it is not just a matter of race and ethnicity. It's also a matter of class. And so, indeed, I agree with Darren that we have to have arrangements that protect those lands. And I suspect that we'll come in the course of this discussion to talk about the proposals for an African Land Commission, a tribunal for dealing with these issues, and in fact, reparations committee have placed on the agenda the question of an African Land Commission.
Yes.
And having African lands placed in trust. and the commission having the authority to determine how those lands are allocated to groups of Africans or individuals for their use. The ultimate objective being that the lands are available to Africans for their development rather than being disposed of.
Correct.
Darren,
So I'm not in
Darren,
conflict with Darren.
That is correct.
You did give the case of BV, but I'm interested in West Bobby's cases.
Well, let me get to West Bobby's.
Yes.
The people of West Bobby suffered tremendously because I sat on the Commission of Inquiry in 1984 or about with the introduction of MMA. So this continues suffering. The intention, because we received the grant, and Mr. Alexander could come in. I believe it was CDB that gave us the money. And the CDB made certain specification in relation to these same Crown lands, if I'm correct, Mr. Alexander. And there is where the problem started in West Bobis, because our people could not have afforded these. I believe you had like 30 plus acres and the monies that were required for these lands and how it was allocated. So we suffered, the African community suffered a lot in the 1980s. So the lands that our ancestors have been using, planting, and Mr. Alexander humanized for decades, for over 100 a year, was taken away from us in the 1980s because of the CDB requirement to have leases. There's also
yes, go ahead. Go ahead. I thought you were finished. Go ahead.
The lands that were bought by people of African descent. That we are, for example, the lands in Kingley, that the government have been actively involved in disposing and disenfranchising.
How have they gone about doing that, Darren?
By the use of the state, by the use of the police, and use of their supporters and telling them to go on the land.
And these are African ancestral lands.
Yes. Yes. That is the problem.
And as Vincent has said, the justification for that is that these lands are lands that are owned by the government, whether it's the NDC.
But they're not owned by the government.
They're
not owned by the government.
Remember the categories I mentioned, David.
Yes.
Remember the categories I mentioned. In the case of West Berbice and Kingley in particular, the lands that are affected were the lands purchased.
Right, proprietorship.
By Kojo McPherson.
Yes.
The land purchased by Kojo McPherson. And what the government has done is, on one hand, they have encouraged people through a claim of prescriptive rights to say they have a right to those lands. And here's where the question of the protection of ancestral lands come in. They've tried to use prescriptive rights as one of the mechanisms, occupancy of the lands. But they've also attempted where the lands are undivided. In other words, these lands are not individually allocated out. They come under the local authority to use the local authority to say that we have authorized people to acquire and to occupy these lands. You know, when I inquired about Kingley, there was a big issue about the documentation at the village, at the neighborhood council. Unlike other places, they can't even find the documentation, because what the documentation does is to show how the undivided lands were allocated for agriculture and other purposes to the descendants of the McPhersons. Now, they may not have occupied all of the lands, and people came in, started to occupy the lands, and through a claim of prescriptive rights on one hand, and through the intervention of the state on the other hand, they've attempted to occupy and lay claim to those lands with the assistance of the central government.
Darren?
You see, let me get in here. The issue.
Yes.
I'm from Litchfield. Matter of fact, in Litchfield, you know, there's a debate because we believe we are the first transported village. in Guyana. The first transported village. And when you look, you read the literature out there in relation to Kojo McPherson and what he did in West Bobbies, in particular Litchfield too as well, that he bought and transport. We were transported in 1940, the 12th of November.
1840.
Whereas Victoria was transported since sometime about 1854.
Buxton claimed they're the first transported.
Yes, Buxton was transported.
We were the Land Commission of Inquiry, and we have
We should make that an issue.
Yeah. But go on and make the point you want to make about Litchfield.
So the transports that we have in Litchfield, Litchfield or transported land in Litchfield, compared to Buxton transport or any transport, our transport is in 1840. So quote unquote, when we were a village, Victoria was still a plantation. Buxton and all of those villages were still plantations.
Buxton was transported in 1840.
What the 41 month? That's the thing. So we at the Land Commission of Inquiry, when we and we saw the transport, I believe there was no other village that was transported before Litchfield. And the literature here and Kojo McPherson being the pioneer as it relates to buying lands in Guyana immediately after slavery. When I visited the registry at New Amsterdam for the book on Litchfield, it can't be found. The property register book cannot be found. So and the issue too, in Litchfield, as they said, the lands were in strips, as the point was made this today. You have persons who came to Litchfield after and buy a single plot and believe that they own from sea to creek, which is not the case. And we in Litchfield allow that. At some point, it will be challenged because we have to raise it. We're not going to continue to tolerate it in the village or anywhere else. You bought it from, then you believe you could apply for prescriptive title for the entire Cedar Creek, how many miles. So that's the issue that need redress. Yes, brother. I believe
yes.
in relation to West Coast Bobbies.
West Coast Bobbies. And I'm hearing here.
The books are missing. Mr. Alexander touched the point. The books are missing.
Yeah.
Government encouraging people to go on the land and prescribe for it, albeit not being government land or state land. Oh, and to that, I want to touch on something on the legislation here.
Yes.
Give me 1 second. And I'm reading from the explanatory memorandum, right? Clause 2. Right? Clause 2 of the bill seeks to amend section 7 of the Principal Act by forcing providers that the vesting of compulsory acquiring land in the state is subject to prompt payment. Well, I deal with the prompt, which means and it is the by prompt payment. No, there's no need for due diligence. As I'm afraid that the PPP somewhere at Freedom House in Bar Settlement, somewhere in Freedom out in New Amsterdam Main Street, somewhere different Freedom House, the PPP may already have these things right up on a piece of paper because it's a prompt, right? So the minister now, because of this legislation, believes that he's acting in good faith and he's doing the right thing. I'm speaking as a lawyer here. Good. Prompt payment for purchase money or of any adequate compensation. Minister got some money available. Minister must pay out promptly. Minister see this land. Minister want this land. Somebody comes and say, Minister, this is a me land. You put on paper, Minister, this is a me land. Minister say, by Mr. Satisfy a you land. And the question also begs too, if this impedes on the role and functions of the judiciary. That is the question. Isn't it only for the judge to make pronouncement in relation to ownership of the law? Is the minister, is the executive usurping the roles and function of the minister? When the registrar of deed grants transport to a land, he or she sits as a judge in that capacity. So the minister here is a judge. Justice Ejila, Justice Indar. The minister here is now a judge of the High Court. by this same provision here, the minister.
Does that not fly in the face of separation of powers?
That is what I'm saying. You usurping the role of the judiciary. This is what flies in the face of that. Secondly, the proposed amendments subject one to guarantee the state the right to vacant land is compulsory acquired. So all those lands in Kingley, all those backlands in Litchfield, because as I said, the book is missing in Litchfield. Our book is missing. Like many of the African villages, the books are missing. They don't have transport. You know, for example, in my village, only you get some issues and this vehicle. Like somebody go and do a little fence, then some relative, somebody because of this is our land, this is my grandmother, what have you, true oral. And the thing, you know, I raised it on Sunday yesterday. That not Africans not disposing of the land through will or not leaving any will and so for the land. But I believe part of the African culture too as well is oral tradition. So probably that also they need to take into consideration, as I mentioned, Mr. Alexander just mentioned, in relation to law reform. Not what we just get from the colonial. So those lands in Litchfield, in the pasture, those lands at Kingley, all of those lands, they're gone. Because the minister get up one morning, he said he wants development. And he wants development. Somebody appeared before the minister and said, Abiland. And the minister and the state suddenly owns the land. There's no recourse for you then because the minister is acting in good faith. So this ultimate promptness, as I believe, if this legislation is passed, the sprint or an alacrity that I see the minister of works, infrastructure and development gonna move, it's gonna be fast, it's going to be swift. That is what I suspect.
Vincent, we're running out of time. Where do we go from here? The bill is going to be debated on Wednesday. It's most likely if the government has its way, because it has a built-in majority in the National Assembly, they're going to pass the bill. Where do we go from here?
Well, first of all, notwithstanding that, I think those who represent our interests in Parliament should demand that this bill goes to special select committee, so that we can have further national discussion in keeping with our constitution, which talks about inclusion and participation on this matter. And for me, if it goes to the select committee, the contention should be beyond this bill. It should be about the regime. It should be the moment when we argue for the regime, for the protection of African lands. Secondly, I think there is a need for local leadership to come alive, and for local leadership to take a stand and a démarche on this matter, so that we can defend our lands in law and in fact. Because sometimes you have to act in fact. In law alone don't work.
Right.
The people in Kingley have largely acted in fact. And we have to be on the alert to act in fact, even as we seek to act in law. Now, the fact of the matter is that we also need to raise the consciousness of people on these matters, because over generations, many people have lost the consciousness and awareness. And therefore, we have obligation among ourselves to raise the consciousness and awareness, because it's only if we raise the consciousness and awareness, then we can have the action both in law and in fact. So we are challenged at this time to look at this matter from a legal perspective and from a mobilization perspective in pursuit of what has been lacking: our recognition, justice, and finally the material for development.
Material for development. Lance is telling us they have the same issues in Fire Ridge, Gibraltar. I'm also hearing that as you go eastward along the Quarantine Coast, that you have the same problems in that bunch of villages there, Manchester, Liverpool, etc., having the same kind of issues. In fact, recently the government was attempting to build a canal through there, and the issue of ancestral lands raised its head. Darren, as we go
let, let me say this.
yes,
No,
go ahead. Hold on, Darren. Let Vincent.
I need to run. So I just want to give my
All
closing word as you give it to me.
Yes.
Please. Before I go, I will just like to say as my closing words, because I suspect that's what you're going to give to me.
Yes.
And that for our people to be vigilant. Vigilant is it? We need to come together. We need to unite and to overcome. And I know you're going to like this, brother, and overcome this little trouble. Bob Marley, Africans Unite.
Yes.
And particularly the people in Plaisance, be vigilant. They may want to take those lands in the back of Plaisance and the East Coast. Let us be vigilant and let us work together. Africans Unite. Thank you. And
thank you very much, Darren. And we'll have to come back because, as you would appreciate, Darren, yes, there is much more to this discourse.
Yes.
So I will arrange in a couple of weeks, because we're going into the holidays. But certainly as we enter the new year, for you all to come and ventilate on this issue. All right? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Vincent, you were interviewing.
Yes, I was making the point that the government's first demarche is on the granted lands. That's the first demarche. It's not necessarily restricted to those, because there is lesser argumentation about our ownership of those than about the ones we acquired by purchase. Mm-hmm. So the first demarche is on the granted lands. And that's a lot of what happened in West Berbice, the granted lands and the occupied lands. Mm-hmm. That's their first demarche on our granted lands or occupied lands. But I want to make, in closing, the following observation. Why is it that the government would prevent or try to prevent its PPP from having a symposium, a forum on ancestral lands? About a year and a half ago, PPP called a forum on ancestral lands at JTC.
Yes, I remember that.
And the government intervened and instructed the principal of JTC that the auditorium should not be made available to us, though we had used it for a number of occasions, and we had a collaboration going with JTC. JTC is the place where we got funds, and we trained 50 auto electricians. People forget that. The government intervened. Therefore, one has to ask, why would they not want us to have a forum on ancestral lands? So I am saying that there's a disposition of this government towards people of African descent and their land issue in particular. And in responding to United Nations questions, they sought to contend that there were no internal issues of inequity or inequality of the people of African descent, and that the only issue was one for reparations from the colonizers. So that we are fixed in a situation where the government has a disposition that is negative towards the people of African descent, a disposition that is manifest in the way in which they're dealing with our lands. It's manifest. And therefore, we have a challenge to localize and internationalize this issue, because it flies in the face of our rights. It flies in the face of the recognition by the universe in the form of the United Nations that these issues ought to be addressed. And we have in a state, they're not in denial, they're pretending denial that they don't have these problems to deal with.
Vincent Alexander, the chairman of IPPADG. Vincent, as usual, thank you very much for coming on, and thanks to Darren. along with Deon Abrams, who was part of that panel yesterday. I want to thank Padaji for raising the consciousness again about these issues, because a lot of times, Vincent, these issues are presented as colorblind. Because one can look at a bill like this and say, what does acquisition of land have to do with African people or Amerindian people or East Indian people, as the case may be? Well, they do. Because as you have pointed out over and over again, we are a plural society. We are a plural society. And when we talk about laws, we talk about policies, we have to ground them within that plurality. And so I'm very glad that Padaji has raised this issue again, that laws and the practice and policies in Guyana cannot be colorblind, given our plurality. Vincent Alexander, always, thank you very much, my brother.
Thank you very much, David.
Vincent Alexander there of Ipadaji, and there's never a dull day. As we move into the Christmas season, you never get a chance to say, let's breathe, because you know, this government is so insensitive, so insensitive. And what they do is they try to point the gun, proverbial gun, at those of us who are standing at the gate and are saying, but you can't do this. They are so racially insensitive. How can you, in a society like ours, as a party that is supported by one ethnic group, not take into consideration the racial sensitivities of brothers and sisters? And that is why when they come to us and say they want our votes and they want to black people this and black people that, they're not interested. They just want to pimp off black people. And that is why somebody like myself are of the disposition that they ought not to come into our communities to do certain things, because they have no good intention. This is not a government of all of the people. Theoretically, it cannot. And practically, they're behaving in these insensitive ways. We have got a lot to talk about, and I am going to revisit this subject in short order, because it is one of the, as we move deeper down into the 21st century, land is going to be prime again. Oil, don't be fooled with the oil. Oil is not forever. Oil has a shelf life. At the end of the day, land is going to be premium again. As they said back then, land, look at land, a God country. And that's when our foreparents, guided by that insight, decide to buy the land. They go to the master and say, how much you sell them for? And when he call the price, they say, are we go buy them? Are we go buy them? Are we go buy them? And that always has to be at the center of this discourse. Good night to you all. And tomorrow night, we are going to be back for another edition of Politics 101.